Okay, so we are long-term, or maybe long-term is a little too strong a word for it, but somewhere in the near future we are most likely going to start a study of Christian character. But the materials for that are currently in the process of sort of going through some review before we do anything with that. Jerry, I hope you brought the booklet with you today. Excellent. So, so we're going to take a couple of weeks, or maybe a little more than that, to do a brief study of Esther. And I passed out a worksheet to you. I apologize for how small the type was. I created this a long time ago when my vision was better, and the vision of most of the people that I was teaching to was better because they were college age, I think, maybe, and so I didn't really realize just how bad it was, but it's a PDF, and so I can't actually alter the size of it the way I could with a Word document. So we're kind of stuck with what we've got, so get out your magnifying glasses when you're at home and go from there. So what we're going to do, though, today is actually kind of lay down some groundwork for the book, because the book begins with a discussion of Artaxerxes and his queen before his queen was Esther. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that aspect of it today as kind of, like I said, a foundational thing, and then we'll work our way through this worksheet and through the study of the book itself over the next few weeks here. So let's start with Esther chapter 1. You may want to turn over there. I'm going to actually project the, what is it, the New American Standard on the screen there, but if you have a different version, you may want it. I don't know. So we start off in Esther chapter 1 with the writer of the book, who doesn't identify him or herself, putting the book in context. And we start off by talking about Artaxerxes, or as the book of Esther talks about him, at least in the New American Standard Translation, Ahasuerus, which was the name that the Jews actually gave to Artaxerxes. It was not his common name that was used by him as the king, but the Jews gave him that name out of respect, and we'll see why in a little bit here. But Esther chapter 1 begins by saying, it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel in Susa, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. Okay, so to put this in context, what kingdom did Artaxerxes or Ahasuerus rule over? Anybody know?
Syria or Babylon?
Wrong on both choices, but nice try. Cush is not the word that most people are used to. Let's see if we can use a term that is a little more familiar to most people.
Persia.
No, Persia, there we go. Or rather, to be more accurate, the Medo-Persian Empire. It combined the Medians and the Persians. This took place after Babylonia was taken over by Persia, so you were on the right track, you just were 150 years or so too far back. So if you recall, the Israelites were taken into captivity by the Babylonians under, well, eventually under, suddenly his name is Nebuchadnezzar. Several generations later, the Medo-Persian Empire conquered Babylonia basically without a battle. There were battles away from the empire, but they conquered the empire of Babylon essentially from within. And then ultimately the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire became Susa, which is where many of the prominent citizens of Babylonia, including apparently some of the Hebrews, were eventually transported. So Artaxerxes or Ahasuerus, depending on how you want to do that, is in his citadel, his royal palace in Susa. He has basically a 6-month-long party, as best, or at least a 6-month-long open house where he's showing off all of his riches and splendor to all of the important people in his kingdom. Jerry.
Where is this in history from the time the Jews went back to Jerusalem?
Give me just a second. We're going to do
We're going to get to that. All right.
That's a very good question, though. And so that's actually exactly where I'm going with this. So you're thinking like me, which if I were you, I'd be disturbed.
Yeah.
In any event, so we transition, and so let's jump to Ezra, because Ezra is actually where we help to put this in context. So in Ezra chapter 6, we see that the early part of Ezra takes place before Artaxerxes' reign. I'm going to refer to him as Artaxerxes unless we're looking at the text in Esther, because frankly that's easier for me to pronounce and that's the actual name I'm used to. So Artaxerxes was not the king at the time. Darius is the king at the time that Ezra initially went out to help to rebuild the temple of Jerusalem. So in Ezra chapter 6, the temple is completed. It's completed because Darius issues a secondary decree that basically supports the initial one, makes it clear that the work that Ezra and his people are doing is actually legitimate, and as a result of that, the opposition that Ezra has been facing kind of fades away, and they're able to complete the temple. It says the elders of the Jews were successful in building through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet, Zechariah the son of Iddo, and they finished building according to the command of the God of Israel, the decree of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Now, Artaxerxes is mentioned in there, although this happens before Artaxerxes becomes king. Cyrus is the one who allowed them to go back. Darius is the one who then followed on after Cyrus and actually continued to give them authority, and is the one under which the temple is completed. Artaxerxes is mentioned in there because Artaxerxes will become relevant for the latter part of this book, as well as Nehemiah's stuff. It takes place, and the rebuilding of Jerusalem itself takes place under Artaxerxes. So the rebuilding of the temple is completed shortly before Artaxerxes becomes king. So let's continue here. This temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar. It was the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. The sons of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. So, temple is completed under King Darius. Now, Ezra does a leap in time, which is not immediately obvious unless you're paying attention to what a lot of us tend not to pay attention to, which is the discussion of the external kings and rulers and stuff like that. We tend to focus more, understandably, on the spiritual issues and on the issues relating to the stuff that directly impacts the Jews. But if you actually read and pay attention to who's being mentioned in Ezra, you can see that there's a jump in time. Because in Ezra chapter 7, so this is basically immediately after, there's a couple more paragraphs after this, they're talking about the dedication of the temple. In Ezra chapter 7, it says, now after these things. And that's one of those kind of phrases that can mean a lot of different things. It can mean, like the next day, or it can mean, as it turns out here, like more than a decade later. After these things, in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, there went up Ezra, son of Sariah. So what has happened is, Jewish history tells us that Ezra, after he completed the temple, Ezra worked for the king. So he went back to Susa, most likely, and sort of checked in and spent some time there, but probably heard some of the same things that Nehemiah was hearing and decided to go back again to the land. And so it says, this Ezra went up from Babylon. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, which the Lord God of Israel had given. I should point out that actually, I'm not sure that the early part of Ezra, that Ezra is even actually physically there in the land. In any event, this time Ezra goes to the land for sure. And it says, the king granted him all he requested because the hand of the Lord his God was upon him. Some of the sons of Israel and some of the priests, the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants went up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. So this puts us very clearly in the time frame of where things are going up. The Jews have already returned. They returned under Cyrus. That was when they were allowed to go back. This is now, after Cyrus's return, this is now, I want to say, something like 25 or 30 years later, maybe even a little bit more than that Ezra goes up. And Artaxerxes has been king for about 7 years now. So if we switch over to Nehemiah, we see that Nehemiah actually went up even later. In the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, he was the cupbearer for the king. And it says, wine was before him, the king, and I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. The king said to me, why is your face sad that you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. He's not saying that in an insulting way. He's saying, I'm trying to understand why you're sad. Something is obviously troubling you. Nehemiah says, I was very much afraid because, you're not supposed to be negative in the presence of the king. So I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why? Actually, I forgot. Somehow this got omitted from there because it actually says, well, then I was very much afraid, and I prayed to the Lord. And then I don't know how I missed that because it's kind of important, actually, I feel like, in there. But anyway, he says, I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire? Actually, I'm sorry, I got it out of order. Then the king said to me, what would you request? That's when he prayed to the God of heaven. I said to the king, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. So we see that Nehemiah goes up in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, and he begins rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. So the people had returned to Jerusalem and lived there some decades and even rebuilt the temple, but the wall of Jerusalem was not completed, and the city itself was still largely in ruins. It's not until Nehemiah goes that he is able to take with him and have the funds and the means and the authority to actually rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and go forward from there. The exiles had not been given that authority, and to rebuild the wall of a city that had been captured could potentially have been seen as both insulting and threatening to the king, and so the exiles were probably unwilling to do that, as well as perhaps fundamentally unable to in terms of the means that they had. And so Nehemiah is the one who goes to do that. So the two kings in Persian history that are regarded with great affection by the Jews are Cyrus, who issues the decree that allows them to return, and Artaxerxes, because he is the one who allows them to rebuild the temple. And as we'll see in the story of Esther, he also is the one who ends up supporting them in their cause against Haman, as well as other people who are out to persecute the Jews. So this is kind of the context we have. Understand that the number of people who went back to Jerusalem was almost certainly far less than the number of people who remained in the Persian Empire, the former Babylonian Empire, as well as the Assyrian, where the Assyrians had dispersed the Israelites to. The vast majority of Jews, history tells us, stayed there. Only a relatively small group actually went back to Jerusalem during this period of time. More of them were repatriated later in history, but during this period of time, the majority of them are still in Persia rather than in Judah and Jerusalem. Okay, any questions? Yes, sir.
So about what time period are we at right here?
That is a good question. Let me look real quick here. I'm not 100% sure, but my notes will have this. So, okay, so yeah, 483 to 473 is the best guess of Esther's BC. 483 to 473 BC is the period of time.
And Solomon's temple has been destroyed.
Yes, yeah.
And they don't rebuild the temple until Herod, right?
No, Herod basically expands and greatly upgrades the temple that they had rebuilt. So the Israelites who were exiled, some of them returned to Jerusalem, and under the direction of Ezra and others, they rebuild the temple. It's stated that some of the people who were there were ones who had been there when the previous temple existed, and they weep because of, it's unclear, but it seems like it's two things. They weep because the temple is being rebuilt, but they also weep because the glory of the temple has been lost to such a significant degree from where Solomon's temple was. When Herod becomes king, one of the things that he does in an effort to try to make himself popular with the Jews, because he's not really a Jew and they all know it, is that he spends a lot of money on building projects, and the single biggest one is the Temple of Herod, which is, he takes the existing temple and basically rebuilds it and overhauls it and turns it into this magnificent thing. So the temple existed prior to Herod, but he upgraded it hugely. Ken?
What's the difference between Susa and Babylon?
I'm not entirely sure about that, actually.
Are they different locations?
I think so, because Babylon, as far as I know, never bore that name. So I think that Susa is further. Where is Babylon? I gotta visualize Babylon. Babylon is not too far from where Ur of the Chaldees was. I think Susa is further to the east than Babylon is, but I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. I don't know. So, but I don't think it's Babylon. Anyway. Any other questions or comments or anything? Okay, so let's transition. We're going to talk about the rest of the first chapter of Esther today, and we'll wrap up at that point, assuming we get that far. So what did you find?
There's a map here. It has Babylon there, and it has Susa over there.
Oh, so Susa's north of there, at least if I'm...
Oh, east.
It is east of there, okay. So
Yeah.
Susa's further east than Babylon. Okay, gotcha. All right, so my memory was vaguely correct, although it was more
It's
guessing
over
than
by
anything
the-
else.
Susa was an area, not a town.
See.
So that makes sense, because that Persia started further east than Babylon. That's why it seemed to me that that was likely. Jerry, what did you ask?
Susa is an area, not a town.
No, Susa is a city, as
It
well
is
as an
a
area.
city.
Yeah, it's kind of like
On
Babylon.
the map.
Babylon is a city as well as a country, and Susa is kind of the same thing. But Susa is not the empire the way Babylon was the Babylonian Empire. Susa is at most a region, but it's primarily, there's a citadel there, there's an actual city in Susa. That's where the capital of the Persian Empire was, and so that's where this is set. This is not taking place in Babylon, although many of the people who are involved in this were people who would have been taken captive by the Babylonians and later been transported to Susa as the court was moved from Babylonia to Persia. So after 180 days of showing off and maybe sort of partying, actually I think it's showing off because then it says when these days were completed, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So he throws a huge party for 7 days. There were, and it goes through and describes the opulence, the wealth of this. There were hangings of fine white and violet linen held by cords of fine purple linen and couches of gold and silver on a mosaic. I wonder if the couches were like the color of gold or silver, or if they were made out of gold and silver, because that would be kind of uncomfortable to sit on, right? Anyway, these were on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, and I didn't look up what that is, but there's also marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. So understand this, these couches are sitting on, what people are walking on is marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones are literally embedded in the ground around them. This guy's going all out to show off how wealthy and fabulous he is. Drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine was plentiful according to the king's bounty. I mean, this just sounds like just some sort of a completely out of control party. What's interesting actually is what it says next. The drinking was done according to the law. Now here in Arizona, we have laws about what you can do after you drink, like you can't drive a car. We don't have any laws about, well, I guess you do have some how much you're supposed to serve people, but that's not what he's talking about here, because it goes on and says there was no compulsion. In other words, nobody was forced to drink. For so the king had given orders to each official of his household that he should do according to the desires of each person. Now this is interesting, and it actually serves to call out right off the bat something that we know and we'll see from other places in Esther. We also know this from Ezra and Nehemiah and from history in general, is that Artaxerxes is he's very conscious of the fact that the people in his realm have different perspectives and different viewpoints. And he does his best to be accommodating. He's not like some of the kings of Babylon, for example, when we see Daniel and his friends are taken into captivity, and they're kind of chosen out, and they're looking for people to integrate into Babylonian society who come from the different cultures. But they're looking to integrate them. They're not looking to integrate their culture into theirs. And so Daniel and his friends are taken, and they're basically expected to eat the right foods and to drink the same drinks, and it's choice foods and wine and stuff like that. And Daniel and his friends all say, we can't do that. And initially, at least, the response of the people in charge is, you have to do that. It's a requirement. And Daniel is able to negotiate with them an alternative, which is give us a week or two, whatever it was, and see how we look after that, based on eating what we're supposed to eat, and see how we look. And they eat vegetables and drink water, and by the end of that time, they're in much better shape than the other guys are.
Two things, it's 10 days.
10,
Porphyry is a reddish purple granite,
Okay.
which fits with the scheme of royalty and royal colors.
Yeah, probably expensive, and that sort of thing. So, okay, good. So Daniel is so we see in that situation that the Babylonians, while they did want to integrate people from other nations, they wanted them to follow their customs. The goal was to make them Babylonian, not to turn Babylonia into other stuff. But Artaxerxes is more willing to be open-minded. He is not trying to enforce what he wants to do on everybody else. And that's significant because, number one, it speaks to why he would even be willing to consider a queen that was not from the noble line, wasn't from the Persian, wasn't of Persian royalty or something like that. And more broadly, it speaks to his desire to try to work with the religious needs of the people around him, and that fits right in with his being willing to authorize Nehemiah to go and rebuild the walls and to do some of those things like that we know from history that he did tend to do. Queen Vashti, who is his queen, also gave a banquet for the women in the palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So Vashti gives a banquet for the women, Artaxerxes or Ahasuerus gives a banquet for all of the men that are there. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, which is a nice way of saying he was, plastered, basically, he commanded, I love that the scripture put it that way, his heart is merry with wine, we ought to say that about people who come, stumbling out of bars, they're merry with wine, Anyway, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. Now, our modern sentiment gets in the way of understanding or dealing with this passage because we read this, and I think to a certain extent, rightly so, we look at this and go, this is kind of a messed up situation. The guy is drunk, and now he wants his pretty queen to come out so he can show her off, and it's probably going to be demeaning and awkward and everything else. And there's a real possibility that that's the situation because the guy is drunk, and all of the people that are there with him are probably drunk, and so who knows? But it's also important to recognize, number one, that he is actually the king, and so what he says goes. And secondly, that may not necessarily be how this was going to turn out. That maybe he was proud of his wife and wanted her to come out so people could see how beautiful she was, and that was really the end of it. The scriptures, and this is one of those places where, because the scriptures in many cases are written by people who are recounting facts rather than moralizing, they don't really take a position on this. There's no judgment made about whether this was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, or what his motivations were or anything else. In the Chronicles, you get that. If you want to know for sure whether a king did the right thing or not, read the Chronicles. It'll tell you. He went, basically, he went to hell and he went to heaven. I mean, it's right in there. And it talks about, the thing he did displeased the Lord or whatever. In Esther, there's never any discussion of that. So we're not going to see the question answered of whether this was appropriate or not. What we are going to see is what the king does, and that's what's important for us in terms of moving the story forward. So Queen Vashti, it says, she refused to come at the king's command delivered by eunuchs. Yes?
Just a quick question. Is Esther before or after the 20 years that Nehemiah refers to?
We don't know that for sure.
Okay, so it's sometime around that point.
Yeah, actually, according to this, it's between the 6th and 7th chapters of Ezra. And I may be mistaking this. I may be confusing this because my comment. So I've looked at 2 different commentaries. I hadn't actually looked at the commentary in this Bible. The commentary I was reading from was using the name Artaxerxes. This Bible, in the New American Standard that I'm looking at here, is saying this is actually Xerxes, not Artaxerxes, and thus it would have been between Darius and Cyrus of Darius, and then Artaxerxes, who was Xerxes' son. And so I'm not entirely sure which one of those. One of the problems with Esther is that there is no supporting documentation or historical evidence for the events of this book. There's no decree that we can find. There's no record of a slaughter of people who were seeking to cause problems for the Jews. There's really nothing to support it specifically, which means that we have a certain amount of trouble placing it in context. And so I'm not sure whether I maybe misunderstood something in the commentary I was looking at, or it's just that there's a disagreement between the 2 commentaries. But my Bible, this particular one at least, is telling me that this took place between the 2 of them. So it either would have, depending on the time frame, it either would have been taken place about a decade before Ezra would have gone the second time, and Nehemiah would have gone another 20 years or so later than that, or it would have taken place probably between the time Ezra went and the time Nehemiah went, in that time frame. So it's somewhere in there, but it depends on which king it is, and right now I'm not even sure, because like I said, my research is leading me in 2 different directions all of a sudden. Anyway. So Vashti refuses to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. And we don't know, here again, it could be because she's thinking there's a bunch of drunk men there and this is just a recipe for disaster. It could simply be because she was just not a very good queen and she's like, no, I don't want to come. Whatever it was, the king, it says, became very angry and his wrath burned within him. The king said to the wise men who understood the time, so these are guys who understand what's going on, not just in terms of philosophy, but they understand the reality of the world in which the king exists. He says, it's the custom of the king to speak before all who knew law and justice. And I had to cut out a part to get this to fit on this particular screen, but it says, he tended to do that in public. Like, he didn't just ask them privately, he would ask people that he was comfortable with, that he knew that they knew what they were doing, he would ask them in public. And he asked them, and he says, according to the law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? And Memucan, who's one of the people, I cut out the list of all their names because I didn't think you wanted me to recite the names of the 7 eunuchs, or not eunuchs, the 7 wise men or whatever. Memucan, who's one of them, says, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. Well, that's a pretty serious charge. She's wronged not just the king, but she's wronged everybody. And Memucan goes on to explain, he says, for the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands by saying, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought into his presence, but she did not come. So, Memucan's concern is that the example of the queen with respect to the king, who has, as we'll see later in Esther, absolute authority, would potentially lead other women to treat their husbands with the same lack of respect, to disobey them. And so he's concerned about not just the what this looks like in terms of the king, but the larger example that this is setting. This, as well as the rest of the discussion, is part of what has led me to a more what's the word I'm looking for? Moderated opinion of what was going on here. For most of my life, I have taken the position or made the assumption that this was a drunk guy trying to come out and parade his wife in a potentially inappropriate manner in front of everybody. But some of the things that we see here and some of the arguments that are made are relatively sound, at least in the context in which they were existing, and it kind of fits the idea that it wasn't necessarily unreasonable what he was asking, and that he wasn't necessarily looking to do anything inappropriate, but rather that it was simply an expectation he had as the king, and by refusing to do it, the queen was refusing what would be considered a reasonable command under the circumstances. Regardless, though, the simple fact is that because of how the king is, the opinion that he has, and what Memucan has said, the argument has now been put out there that this isn't just a problem for the king, this is a problem for the whole nation. And Memucan continues and he says, this day the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the king's conduct will speak in the same way to all the king's princes, and there will be plenty of contempt and anger. So Memucan is concerned this is going to get out of control real fast. There is a significant element, obviously, of chauvinism built into this, but that's the reality of the world in which the patriarchs and the Old Testament basically function, for that matter, the New Testament as well. And so we just kind of have to deal with that for what it is. He goes on, he says, if it pleases the king, let a royal edict be written by him, or issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be repealed. This is setting up a major plot point of the story of Esther, which is that once a decree has been issued by the king, it cannot be repealed. That Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. So, yes?
This thing about not being able to repeal, in your vast historical knowledge and research, that seems awfully cumbersome.
It does, doesn't it?
Was that fairly typical of these monarchies?
No. Well, not really. I mean, we don't have, part of the thing is we don't necessarily have a lot of evidence for how this worked in most civilizations. We have a few of the preservations of some of the ancient laws and stuff like that, but the appeals process or the process of making new laws has never really been something that a lot of people write about. The Esther is one of the few places that I can think of where we actually have a concrete statement about what can be done. As it turns out, though,
Daniel's another one.
And Daniel's another one. And it's the same context. He's in Persia by the time that happens. As a practical matter, what we quickly find out, though, is that, yeah, you can't repeal it, but you can sort of override it, by doing things. I think the idea behind it is, and you can kind of see the logic in this, you want to have continuity of government. You don't want from one king to the other things to be constantly changing around. And in some cases, if you're the king, you want to make sure that your descendants don't go through and mess up something that you did. And so maybe that's the thinking, is that you're going to do that. But again, the practicalities, because it is so relatively easy to overrule it or override it by doing something else, I'm not sure how, it's just kind of an odd setup, But basically it's kind of trying to make it so that you can't change your mind afterwards. So Anyway, the idea he has is that she can no longer come into the presence, and the king has to give her a royal position to another who is more worthy than she. And when the king's edict, which he will make, is heard throughout all his kingdom, great as it is, then all women will give honor to their husbands, great and small. So he's got this idea. You know, we're gonna fix this. We're gonna nip this in the bud. We're not gonna have any women rebelling against their husband's authority. We're gonna take care of this right now by making an example out of her. We're gonna take her, you know, queenship away from her, and she won't be able to come into your presence.
Hey, Ryan,
What's that? Yes,
I
sir.
have a question. So the king back then was not an elected official.
No.
He was the law of the land. So is any law he makes irrevocable? He can kind of
Yes.
do whatever he wants, right?
Yes, but yes, technically, so he's not an elected official, but just because you're not elected doesn't mean that there aren't rules that govern what
That's
you can
what
and
I'm
can't do.
asking, okay.
Yeah, so the Persians had set up rules, systems, and when you have an empire as huge as there was, you have to. Because it's not like, you know, I mean, this isn't like a city king who can kind of oversee everything and make sure nothing gets out of control. You have to have rules, you have to give authority to other people to go exercise those rules. And so if you don't follow the rules, I mean, in a way, it's kind of this situation writ large. If the king doesn't follow the rules, pretty soon the people that work for the king start to think, I don't have to follow the rules either. And that's really a problem if you're the king, because you're the guy who's making the rules. So,
Right.
so the kings typically follow the rules the same way that, you know, throughout most of history, people who are operating as dictators within a system tend to follow the rules of that system simply because the rules of that system are what give legitimacy to your reign, and if you lose that legitimacy, you can risk losing your control even if you are a dictator. So,
Gotcha.
anyway. Okay, so we got to nip this whole women uprising thing in the bud, and this is how we're going to do it. So it says, this word pleased the king and the princess, and the king did as Memucan proposed. So he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, that every man should be the master in his own house. You know, basically take care of your own stuff, guys. Now, there's a lot of things in here that, as I said, when we think about it in our modern context, we don't like a lot of this. We don't like, you know, it sounds, I mean, now, in the Church of Christ, where we do still have a fairly strong grip on the idea of male spiritual leadership, it doesn't trouble us as much as if you read this passage to someone, you know, just read it in a general group of people out in the public, where they would probably get offended and upset and everything else. But the simple fact is that there is a lot of, like I said, there's a certain degree of chauvinism built into this. There's a certain degree of sort of reactionaryism, if that's a word, going into this. But the thing that's interesting to me is that he is the absolute king. He can do whatever he wants to. And what's interesting to me is that Memucan does not suggest, nor does the king decide to simply execute her, which he totally could have done. As we'll see a little bit later in Esther, if you enter the king's presence without his permission, he can have you executed on the spot simply for having entered his presence. This would definitely qualify as a basis for him to have her executed, and he chooses not to do that. Now, why he chose not to do that is not entirely clear. He may have loved her. I mean, there's that possibility, obviously. He may have felt like that was an overreaction under the circumstances. Who knows what it is? But the thing to realize is that whether we think of it in these terms or not, this was actually exercising a significant degree of discretion, and exercising a significant degree of discretion in terms of the response that he gave to her. And this also speaks to something I was kind of getting at earlier, which is, even though these guys have been drinking, they're not completely brain-addled in terms of how they're thinking. This counselor gives him advice that is not unreasonably reactionary, and it's focused around a larger concern that he has, which may be driven by whatever's going on in the larger context of the culture as well. And the king's response is also relatively metered in terms of how he reacts. He's not looking to execute her. He's not looking to do something extreme. He's simply looking to deal with the situation for what it is. And so the result is that this letter goes out to everybody saying, you know, basically this is what has happened, this is what the king has done as a response. You should follow after the leadership of the king in terms of how you deal with your household and the leadership of your household. Okay, that is actually the end of the first chapter. So, Any thoughts, any comments or questions before I kind of wrap this up? We've got about 5 minutes left, and so I don't want to go over for sure, but any questions, any thoughts? Okay.
Unless you tie it back to the beginning of the chapter, that little thing, it was sent to everything according to their script. That was not an easy task.
No.
You roll over 127 provinces, and I'm reminded of what we consider today goes on at the United Nations, where there are people who do translations on the fly as speeches are given and that sort of thing.
Right.
So there had to be a cadre of people in Susa that were fluent in all of these different languages in the different provinces.
It's interesting when that you mentioned that Persia was the largest empire that would exist prior to arguably the Greek Empire, but you can make an argument that the Greek Empire was not as vast and not as numerically, or in terms of diversity, was not as diverse as Persia. Certainly Rome exceeded them. But when you talk about empires that are that big, the difficulties and the complexities, and this kind of goes back in part to my answer that I gave to Ian's question as well, the complexities of operating an empire of that size are kind of staggering. You know, we think about the infrastructure we have just here in the United States to transmit information, to make sure that things happen the way they're supposed to carry out the law, all those different kinds of things, and it's a process that's been built up over the process of 200 plus years and innovations of technology and a whole bunch of different things like that. And we're just dealing with, I mean, it's big, but it's not nearly as big as any of those empires were, and for the most part, we transact in a single language, although we make allowances for a few other languages that are here, but for the most part, we transact in a single language with a relatively common cultural background that makes most of what we do comprehensible to everybody. But if you transition that scenario and you move back to the Persian Empire, where you have multiple languages, multiple cultural backgrounds, I mean, you think about, I was thinking about today, there's a passage we're going to look at in the sermon today that's a little bit confusing. It uses a phrase that seems like a sentence that's incomplete, but it may be best translated as basically, Cain had words with Abel. If you said that to someone in a different language than English, they wouldn't understand what you meant. Because it would come across as basically as Cain said to Abel, and that would be all it said. That's an incomplete sentence. In English, it makes perfect sense. Cain had words with Abel. We know what that means, because not just because we understand English, but because we understand the idiom of English. But idiom is something that is cultural and is not just linguistic. And so when you write something that you're writing to lots of different people, you can't just translate it word for word unless you've already eliminated all the idiom from it. And the very phrase that we were talking about there that it ends with, that every man should be master in his own house, that is an idiom in and of itself. And there's a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily understand that depending on the context that you translated it into another language. So communicating to an empire, a vast empire made up of many different kinds of people with many different backgrounds, is definitely a complex task. And the fact that the Persians, as well as later the Greeks and the Romans, were able to do it speaks partly to the development of history, because they weren't the first ones. They were building on what others had done. But it also speaks to a sophistication that we don't always give them credit for. We think about the Persians or the Assyrians and even the Greeks and the Romans as being relatively barbaric compared to us, and certainly in some of their practices they absolutely were. But in terms of some of their organizational things, particularly the Romans, there were people who encountered the Romans who were just like, the thing that impressed them the most was the Romans' organizational capabilities. And for just in general, we should not ignore the fact that these people weren't morons, and they weren't unsophisticated. They weren't where we are culturally and technologically and those kinds of things, but that's because we've had another 2,500 years of development. To think that they are inadequate for the moment that they're in, or that because their way of looking at the world is different than ours means they're unsophisticated, is a real mistake. And that's probably the most useful lesson we can take moving forward as we look at the rest of Esther. Because the rest of Esther, there's a great deal of nuance and sophistication in what goes on in terms of what the king does, in terms of what Esther does, in terms of what Mordecai does, in terms of what Haman does. And we'll explore some of those things as we go through this. So, any final comments or questions? All right, we're going to stop